that's where I remember it from. I remember every detail of doing that album, because at the time I had my own little business in Newcastle.
Brian Johnson is often seen as the cheerful man in a flat cap, the raspy voice, the big grin, the working-class legend who spent decades lighting up stadiums with ACDC. That version is real, but it's not the full story. Behind the warmth and humor is a man with strong principles. A clear code about what it means to be a true musician and a true performer. And over 40 years in the heart of rock and roll, Brian Johnson came across people who broke that code completely. Today, we look at 7 musicians who, in different ways, earned his lasting disapproval. Let's begin. Starting at number 7, Liam Gallagher. Brian Johnson is a man who grew up with nothing and worked for everything. He was a car windshield fitter from Gateshead before ACDC called him in 1980. He had been in bands that went nowhere. He had watched his music career nearly die completely before it became the most successful thing that had ever happened to him. He understands at a bone, deep level what it costs to build something real in this industry, which is exactly why Liam Gallagher has always represented something that Brian Johnson finds almost impossible to stomach. Liam Gallagher is, by almost any objective measure, one of the most talented rock vocalists of his generation. The voice is genuinely extraordinary. When it works, there is almost nothing like it. Brian Johnson would never deny that. But Liam Gallagher has spent the better part of 30 years acting as though the talent alone was enough. As though the voice exempted him from professional responsibility, from basic decency toward the people around him, from the simple obligation of showing up and behaving like a human being rather than a walking provocation. Brian Johnson has spoken about what he calls the difference between a singer and a performer. A singer, he says, stands there and uses the voice. A performer gives everything to the crowd, every single night, regardless of how they feel, regardless of what happened backstage, regardless of who they are fighting with, or what mood they woke up in. Liam Gallagher, in Brian Johnson's assessment, never fully made that transition. The talent was there. The commitment to actually serving the audience, to genuinely giving rather than just taking the applause, was something Liam always seemed to treat as optional. For a man who gave his voice so completely to AC/DC audiences that doctors eventually told him the hearing damage was permanent, that attitude was unforgivable. Next at number 6, Pete Best. Now this one is going to require some explanation because on the surface it seems too easy, too obvious. Of course people have opinions about Pete Best. The man was replaced by Ringo Starr in the Beatles 3 months before the band became the most famous musical act in human history. That is the kind of story that writes itself. But Brian Johnson's issue with Pete Best is not about the replacement itself. It is about what happened afterward. Brian Johnson has enormous personal respect for anyone who takes a hit like that and comes back with dignity intact. He has spoken about the musicians he admires most, and the word dignity comes up again and again. The ability to absorb something devastating and continue without bitterness, without public grievance campaigns, without making your wound into your entire personality. Pete Best did not do that. What Pete Best did instead was spend decade after decade making the Beatles' story, specifically his own removal from it, the central fact of his public existence. Interviews, documentaries, book deals, the biography that went into considerable detail about his hurt feelings and his belief that he had been treated unjustly. Brian Johnson has never spoken publicly about what he actually thinks about certain individuals, because that is not how Brian Johnson operates. But people who know him well have been very clear that the musicians he has the least time for are the ones who confused their suffering with their legacy, the ones who turned what happened to them into a career in itself. Pete Best was replaced. That is genuinely unfortunate, but the Beatles did not owe Pete Best 40 years of public acknowledgement, and Pete Best's decision to extract maximum personal narrative from a situation that had genuinely moved on without him represented exactly the kind of self, pity that Brian Johnson has never had any patience for. Next at number 5, David Lee Roth. If Liam Gallagher represents talent undermined by a lack of professionalism, David Lee Roth represents something that Brian Johnson finds almost more irritating. Talent consciously buried under performance. Brian Johnson's own stage presence is enormous. The cap, the gestures, the way he works a crowd. Nobody would accuse Brian Johnson of being understated, but every single element of what Brian Johnson does onstage is in service of the song, in service of the audience. The performance exists to deliver the music more completely, not to replace it. David Lee Roth, particularly in his solo career after leaving Van Halen, flipped that equation entirely. The performance became the point, the showmanship became the content, and the music, whatever was actually being played and sung, became the background to Diamond Dave's endless self-presentation. Brian Johnson has said in various interviews that he finds certain performers exhausting to watch, that there is a type of frontman who seems to be performing primarily for himself, who seems to be having a private conversation with his own reflection while nominally entertaining an audience. He was diplomatic enough never to name names in those interviews. But people who know Brian Johnson and know his history with this industry understand exactly who he was talking about. David Lee Roth built a career on being David Lee Roth. And somewhere in there, the music got completely lost. Now, before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now. We do this every single week, going deep on the real stories behind the biggest names in rock history, the things that most channels are too careful to touch. You do not want to miss what is coming up. Next at number 4, Tommy Lee. This one is rooted in something very specific and very serious. Brian Johnson grew up in a world where you kept your private life private, where what happened between you and your family stayed between you and your family, where there were certain lines that a man simply did not cross, because crossing them said something irreversible about his character. Tommy Lee crossed one of those lines in 1998 when a videotape of him and Pamela Anderson was leaked to the public. What most people remember about that story is the tabloid circus that surrounded it. What most people forget is the detail that matters to someone with Brian Johnson's values. Tommy Lee did not only fail to prevent the tape from being distributed. According to Pamela Anderson's own account, detailed in her memoir and Netflix documentary, Tommy Lee was actively involved in the situation in ways that made what happened to her considerably worse than it needed to be. Brian Johnson has a daughter. He has spoken about how completely that fact reoriented his understanding of what matters. He has spoken about respect for women as something fundamental, something non-negotiable, something that he expects from everyone around him and that he has never been willing to compromise on. Tommy Lee's treatment of Pamela Anderson, the casual destruction of another person's dignity and privacy for reasons that came down to ego and recklessness, placed him permanently outside the category of people Brian Johnson considers worthy of any professional respect. The drumming is spectacular. That has nothing to do with it. Next at number 3, Sid Vicious. Brian Johnson was playing in a band called Geordie in the mid-1970s when the Sex Pistols exploded into the British consciousness. He watched the whole thing from a very specific vantage point. He was a working musician trying to make something real in an industry that was not particularly interested in him. He was doing the actual work, night after night, in venues that were not glamorous, for audiences that were not enormous. And then here came Sid Vicious, a man who could barely play bass. A man whose entire contribution to the band he was supposedly part of was almost entirely mythological. A man who was famous, for being shocking, for being a symbol, while the actual music around him was being made by other people. Brian Johnson has never had any tolerance for the idea that attitude can substitute for ability. He grew up in a tradition where you either had it or you did not, and where the having of it required actual sustained effort over a long period of time. You practiced. You performed. You built something. Sid Vicious did none of that. What Sid Vicious did was perform nihilism for an audience that found nihilism exciting for about 18 months before moving on to something else. And then Nancy Spungen died in a hotel room in New York in 1978 with a stab wound to her abdomen, and Sid Vicious died of a heroin overdose 4 months later before his trial concluded, and the mythology around both of them became so enormous that most people completely stopped asking the only question that actually mattered, which was whether any of it had produced anything worth a damn. For Brian Johnson, the answer was no. The music was not worth a damn. The life produced nothing of value, and the enormous cultural weight that has been placed on Sid Vicious in the decades since his death represents, in Brian's view, one of the single most embarrassing episodes in the history of rock criticism. Next at Number 2, Axl Rose. This one requires very little setup. Brian Johnson was forced off the Rock or Bust tour in 2016 because continuing to perform in high decibel environments was going to cost him his hearing permanently. That was a medical decision, not a choice. He did not want to leave. He was devastated by it. Angus Young was faced with the impossible task of continuing a tour with tens of thousands of fans holding tickets and no lead singer. Angus chose Axl Rose. Now Brian Johnson has been extremely careful and extremely professional about what he has said publicly about that decision and about Axl Rose. He has not publicly attacked Axl. He has not gone to the press with complaints. That is not who Brian Johnson is. But read what he has said carefully and the shape of his feelings becomes very clear. Brian Johnson told interviewers that he found out about the Axl Rose arrangement from the news, not from a phone call, not from his bandmates, from the news. That single fact, delivered in Brian's careful, measured way, contains more genuine hurt than most people would express in an hour of complaints. And Axl Rose, the man who replaced him, is everything that Brian Johnson is not. Brian Johnson shows up on time. Brian Johnson is grateful for every night on stage. Brian Johnson has never once in his career placed his personal ego above the needs of the band or the audience. Axl Rose started shows 3 hours late. Axl Rose walked off stage mid-performance. Axl Rose burned every significant professional relationship he ever had through a combination of paranoia, entitlement, and a fundamental belief that the rules applying to everyone else simply did not apply to him. Brian Johnson spent 36 years being the most accessible, most grateful, most genuinely warm frontman in rock music, and when he was forced out through no fault of his own, the man who stepped into his position was his precise opposite in every way that actually matters. That sits with Brian Johnson. It will always sit with Brian Johnson. Subscribe right now if you are still with us, because the number 1 on this list is the one that nobody talks about, and the one that reveals the most about who Brian Johnson actually is underneath the flat cap and the enormous grin. Next at number 1. Bob Ezrin. Most people reading that name will need a moment. Bob Ezrin is not a household name. He is a record producer. He produced Pink Floyd's The Wall. He produced Alice Cooper's classic albums. He is, by almost any measure, one of the most accomplished producers in the entire history of rock music. He is also the man who said publicly in 2016 that Brian Johnson did not have the vocal range to continue as ACDC's frontman, and suggested that the band would be better served by finding a permanent replacement rather than bringing Brian back. Now, on one level, this looks like a professional disagreement. A producer with strong opinions about what is best for a band. It is the kind of thing that happens in the music industry all the time. But context matters enormously here. Brian Johnson had just been forced off tour due to a genuine medical crisis. He was dealing with the possibility of permanent hearing loss. He was watching the band he had given 36 years of his life to continue without him. He was at one of the most vulnerable and most painful moments of his entire career. And Bob Ezrin, a man who had never worked with ACDC, a man who had no professional relationship with Brian Johnson, chose that specific moment to go on record suggesting that Brian was finished, that he was too limited, that maybe it was time for someone better. Brian Johnson eventually had surgery. His hearing was largely restored. He came back to ACDC, he recorded Power Up with Angus Young, and it became one of the band's most successful albums in decades. He proved, definitively and completely, that Bob Ezrin was wrong about every single thing he had said. But the reason Bob Ezrin lands at number 1 on this list is not about the professional disagreement. It is about the timing. It is about a man with considerable public platform choosing the moment of Brian Johnson's greatest vulnerability to publicly question his worth, to publicly suggest that perhaps he was no longer good enough. Brian Johnson was raised in a world where you did not kick a man when he was down, where whatever you thought about someone's professional abilities, you had the basic human decency to wait until they were back on their feet before you said it publicly. Bob Ezrin did not do that, and for a man with Brian Johnson's values, that is not a professional disagreement. That is a character revelation. And what it revealed was something Brian Johnson has never been able to look past. Brian Johnson turned 78 this year. For over 4 decades, his voice has defined rock history, from Highway to Hell and back in Black to Thunderstruck and You Shook Me All Night Long. But beyond the music, Brian was known for his humility. kindness, and respect for the fans who made it all possible. Yet he always had standards. He believed rock was about the music, the audience, and the passion, not ego, fame, or personal glory. In this video, we look at 7 musicians who, in Brian Johnson's eyes, failed to understand that. Some were remembered for ego, some for their actions, and some for forgetting the very thing that made music matter. Brian never forgot. The music always came first,